He was 9 when they gave him a crown, and 15 when his body began to rot from the inside out. Everyone feared him. His court whispered that he saw demons. A boy who looked at his sisters as threats to the throne, dreamed of burning his subjects alive even before he understood how to sign a treaty, and then quietly, relentlessly, his body began to fail him. The physicians did what they could. The prayers never stopped. But in the end, even the most hardened figures of the Tudor court stood at his side, not in grief or in guilt, but because they had never seen a fall quite like it. This is beyond an ordinary story of a young king. It's the story of control taken too soon, of belief without balance, leaving an entire kingdom in terror. This is how Edward VI met his end. Henry VIII's obsession with a male heir was no mere royal desire. It was an all-consuming, desperate hunger that drove the fate of England itself. His marriages, one after another, were battles waged not for love but for legitimacy, stability, and the hope of a son who would carry the Tudor name forward. When Jane Seymour finally gave birth to Edward in 1537, it was a moment steeped in both triumph and tragedy. The birth of a son seemed to promise the end of years of turmoil, but that hope came at a devastating cost. Jane herself slipped away just days later, dying from the cruel toll of childbirth. The boy was left motherless before he had even tasted his mother's embrace. Edward's body was fragile, a tiny trembling thing wrapped in silks and swaddled by nurses who whispered prayers for his survival. Around him hung the ghosts of queens past. 2 wives lost to ambition, to politics, and to the unforgiving nature of childbirth. His sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, meanwhile, stood sidelined, their futures uncertain in a court where male blood was law. From his first breath, Edward was never just a child. He was a symbol, an heir to a fractured throne, a beacon for the hopes and fears of a kingdom. But the very people meant to nurture him, the parents, were absent in all but title. His upbringing was not shaped by gentle hands or lullabies. It was a chess game played out in the halls of power. Edward was raised not by love, but by expectation. Tutors drilled doctrine and duty into him. Courtiers whispered ambitions into his ears. His life was mapped out by others long before he could understand what it meant to be a boy, much less a king. So here's the question that hangs over his earliest days. What becomes of a child who grows not in the warmth of affection, but in the cold shadow of relentless expectation? Can the fragile body of a boy carry the crushing weight of a kingdom's future on such slender shoulders? Have you ever thought about how that kind of childhood, devoid of comfort, rich only in demands, might shape the man Edward was destined to become? When Edward took the crown, he was just a boy whose hands were too small to grasp the heavy orb that symbolized power. The golden crown pressed down on his neck, a weight far heavier than his fragile body could bear. Real power, however, did not rest with Edward. Instead, it was handed to the Regency Council with Edward Seymour, his uncle, and the new Duke of Somerset, quietly pulling the strings from behind the throne. The child king was a figurehead, a puppet shaped by the ambitions of others. Edward's education was a battleground of faith and ideology. Protestantism was not just taught. It was force-fed with an urgency matched only by the administration of his failing health. Tutors drilled into him that the Pope was not a spiritual leader but a cunning enemy. That Catholicism was not just outdated, but a form of treason against both God and crown. His sisters, especially Mary, were cast not as beloved siblings, but as dangerous threats to the divine order being woven around him. In the harsh calculus of power, Mary's Catholic faith made her a rival to be watched, feared, and controlled. Yet beneath this cold political chessboard was a boy growing sharper every day. Edward learned fluent Greek by the age of 10. He devoured the writings of John Calvin, the fiery reformer, absorbing complex theology and statecraft with an almost unnatural ease. His face betrayed no grief when his uncle Somerset was overthrown, only a chilling steadiness. But then, a rare glimpse behind the mask, a private letter, hidden from the eyes of courtiers and counsellors alike. In it, Edward asked a question that cuts through the political myth: why did God make me weak? Why can't I run and play like other boys? Here, in this quiet confession, we see the first true conflict. Is this boy merely craving the love and freedom denied him, or is he already being forged into something colder? A king shaped by duty, distrust, and a ruthless hunger for control. What do you think? Can a child raised in shadows remain innocent, or does power always demand a price? By the time Edward was 12, his body was already betraying him. Chest pains gnawed at him relentlessly. A chronic cough rattled through his fragile frame, each breath a reminder that time was slipping away. Yet, as his body weakened, his mind only grew sharper, colder even. Reports from the court describe a boy who seemed to withdraw into a merciless obsession with purity. The child king was no longer the innocent prince of before. He had become a fervent zealot, fixated on rooting out heresy with a terrifying single-mindedness. His diary reveals a disturbing preoccupation. He meticulously recorded sermons, words heavy with fire and brimstone, where damnation hung over every soul and purging the impure was a divine mandate. The language was stark, relentless, like a drumbeat of judgment echoing through his young mind. Edward's commands grew harsher. He pushed for mass executions, the burning of those deemed Catholic dissenters, a holy cleansing in his eyes. Yet beneath this ruthless drive was a complexity that history often overlooks. One unsettling moment stands out, when a former nurse, a woman who had cared for him and then embraced Catholicism, was condemned to death. Edward hesitated. His signature, required to approve her execution, was delayed. This boy, this king, was not without feeling. He was conflicted, torn between his faith, his conscience, and the harsh demands of power. And that is what makes Edward so haunting. It's not just the cold-blooded zealot he could have been. It's the boy who believed, truly believed, that God was whispering in his ear, guiding him, judging him, pushing him toward a destiny shaped by fire and fear. Is it more terrifying to face a ruthless killer who acts with calculated cruelty? Or a boy who is convinced that every terrible act is a sacred command from above? What do you think lies behind those fragile eyes? Madness? Conviction? Or something far more tragic? Mary Tudor once held her baby brother in her arms. Tiny Edward, swaddled and fragile, a fragile promise of Tudor continuity. But those early moments of tenderness have long since faded into distant memory, replaced by a cold, unforgiving reality. Mary was an open Catholic, a beacon of a faith Edward's court now deemed not just wrong, but dangerous. Under constant surveillance, her every word and action was scrutinized like a crime. Edward, hardened by his tutors and his own fears, threatened to strip her of her right to the throne, to disinherit his own sister in the name of divine purity. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was far more calculating. Her loyalty was ambiguous, her true beliefs cloaked beneath a mask of diplomacy and careful watchfulness. She played the dangerous game of survival with quiet skill, always aware that family here meant nothing without politics. From Mary's perspective, the gulf between them could not be starker. The sister who once cruelled the helpless boy now feared that same boy might see her condemned to the flames. It's a cruel twist of fate, one that turns kin into adversaries, bound not by blood, but by fractured belief. Edward's own hand moved swiftly and mercilessly. He penned legal drafts that aimed to erase both Mary and Elizabeth from the line of succession, reshaping the future of England with ink and decree. Private letters exchanged reveal the simmering tension. Mary refusing to abandon her faith, standing firm in her defiance, while Edward coldly declares, "Obedience to the crown is obedience to God." The court itself grew colder, more paranoid. Whispers floated through the halls like ghosts, servants fearful of overhearing a misplaced word, eyes darting for signs of treason in every shadow. What happens to a boy who no longer sees his sisters as family, but as enemies of God? What dark fracture forms in a heart raised to believe that love must bow before faith, and faith before power? Can a child king surrounded by suspicion and betrayal find room for compassion? Or does such a world carve away every trace of innocence until only cold resolve remains? To Edward, Thomas Seymour was once something more than just an uncle. He was a dashing, larger-than-life figure, charismatic, reckless, and dangerous all at once. A man who promised laughter in a court grown cold, a flicker of wild freedom in a life otherwise chained to duty. But that wildness came with shadows. Seymour's charm masked darker ambitions. One night, in a move both bold and disturbing, he was caught sneaking into Edward's chambers. Keys in hand, he crossed the boundary of trust into betrayal. The accusation, treason. This was no ordinary arrest. It was a rupture in Edward's fractured world. Thomas Seymour was once loved, perhaps even admired. But now, that love had to turn to something far colder. Edward, the boy king, was forced to sign the death warrant of the man who once sought to protect and manipulate him. The diary entry was reported to be something along the lines of, "Today my Lord Admiral was executed. He died well." No tears, no hesitation, just the mechanical marking of a sentence carried out. So was Edward now learning the true meaning of justice, an impartial hand guided by law. Or was this the birth of vengeance carved into the stone of a boy's heart? What do you think? In the eyes of a child forced to wield power, can justice ever be clean? Or is it always stained with personal loss and bitter betrayal? Edward's fragile body was slowly unraveling, bit by bit, breath by breath. The cruel disease that gripped him was likely tuberculosis, though medicine in his time was little more than guesswork and ritual. His cough deepened into a rattling, bone-shaking sound. His chest filled with fluid that no physician could drain. Doctors, desperate and often brutal, took turns experimenting on the boy king. One physician bled him 8 times in a single day, draining what little strength remained. Another resorted to boiling herbs, a strange and painful remedy that did little but scorch his skin. Edward began to waste away before the eyes of the court. His own diary became a ledger of suffering, dry and detached, pain in the chest, spitting matter, dizziness. No tears, no pleas, just the cold facts of a body in decline. Flesh began to recede from his fingers. His face, once full of youthful promise, grew skeletal, hollow, a ghost of the boy he had been. Whispers filled the halls. Some claimed his body had smelled of death weeks before he finally breathed his last. In those final days, Edward spoke often of angels, of judgment and of fire. The eternal fire of damnation. He asked with trembling fear if his sister Mary would undo all his Protestant reforms, if the kingdom would return to the darkness he had fought so to banish. And then, the heartbreaking cry, one that echoes across centuries, betrayed not by enemies, nor by fate, but by his own failing flesh. "I am betrayed by my own body," he seemed to say with every ragged breath. What would you hold on to if your body was turning against you, and the world was closing in? On July 6, 1553, Edward VI breathed his last breath at Greenwich Palace. Just 15 years old, his body ravaged beyond recognition, so disfigured that it had to be sealed quickly in a lead coffin, lest the sight or scent overwhelm those who mourned him. The court fell into a stunned silence. Foreign ambassadors, witnessing the rapid decay of England's young king, reported in horror whispering of a boy consumed not just by sickness, but by the weight of his crown. Yet even in death, Edward was not willing to surrender his hold on the future. Before he passed, he signed a secret document, a desperate final attempt to shape the fate of the kingdom. He named Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, as his successor, deliberately cutting his half-sister Mary out of the line of succession. This small piece of paper sparked a chain reaction that would set England ablaze. The infamous 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, and the civil unrest that followed, a kingdom on the brink of rupture. The cruel poetry in this is that a boy who could barely lift a sword, whose hands were too small to hold the symbols of power, nearly tore a nation in two with a pen. From Elizabeth's eyes, the death of her brother was not just a family tragedy. It was the end of a tumultuous chapter and the beginning of another storm. Edward was gone. Mary, with her fierce Catholic zeal, was rising fast, determined to undo all his reforms and reclaim England for the old faith. Elizabeth, when she finally ascended the throne, would return to Edward's model, but with a softer hand, tempered by the painful lessons of the past. Her rule was grace cloaked in steel, a careful balancing act learned through trauma and survival. Edward, the boy king, was a warning, a living demonstration of what happens when untempered ideology meets power without empathy. His reign showed how easily fear can ignite, how quickly conviction can become cruelty. Do you think Edward VI was a monster forged by his own fears and those who surrounded him? Or was he a mirror, reflecting the ambitions of a father, the fractures of a kingdom, and the perilous weight of a crown placed on too small a head? Edward VI ruled for just 6 short years. But in that brief, fragile reign, he reshaped England's deepest fears. Not the clash of armies, not the roar of rebellion, but the cold, unyielding certainty of a boy who believed he was the voice of God. What if Edward had lived longer? What if his vision had succeeded? Would England have survived the fire he kindled, or burned beneath it? Could a child king wield power without losing himself? And if not, what does that say about the cost of ambition and the price of a crown? If this story disturbed, intrigued, or even challenged what you thought you knew about the Tudors, hit subscribe. Watch out for our next episode, where we'll travel through another episode into medieval history. And I want to hear from you. Comment below, was Edward VI the fanatic, or simply a victim of a fanatic world?